Welcome to Crazy Karen HOA. The HOA wanted control, not safety. You need to stop right now. That fence is not in compliance and you are going to pay for every inch of it. I am calling a hearing and you will be fined $200 a day until you tear it down. I stood in my backyard with a tape measure in one hand and a level in the other, staring at Ruth Cooper, the communications director of the Parkside HOA board, who had just stormed onto my property without knocking. She held a laminated policy sheet between us like it was a shield and a handheld radio in her other hand like she was about to call in an airstrike. Her black windbreaker flapped in the wind and her gray baseball cap was pulled low over her eyes, but I could see the fury in her face. She was screaming so loud that my neighbor 2 doors down had stopped mowing his lawn to watch. I moved to Pittsburgh 6 months ago for a mailroom supervisor job at a corporate office downtown. I hate chaos. I need structure, predictability, and clean processes. The Parkside HOA board sold itself as a quiet neighborhood with reasonable rules, but within a week I realized it was a place where every backyard upgrade became a committee argument. Ruth Cooper ran the show. She controlled the design compliance hotline, which was just her cell phone, and she wrote herself into every violation report. If you wanted to paint your shutters or plant a tree, you went through Ruth, and Ruth made sure you knew she was doing you a favor. I needed a fence. My shift starts at 6 in the morning, and I need gate access to get my car out fast. If the HOA started blocking parking or harassing contractors, I could lose my job. I filed the application 2 months ago. I included drawings, specs, materials, and a survey. I paid for an expedited review. I followed every rule in the handbook. I got written approval. I hired a licensed contractor and we started work on a Monday. By Tuesday afternoon, Ruth was on my lawn with a bullhorn. She claimed the corner post had moved 1 inch during alignment and that it was intentional encroachment. She said I was trying to steal her friend's property and that the entire fence was illegal. She stood in front of the contractor truck and refused to move. She took photos of the post, the string line, the dirt, and my face. She said she was filing an emergency complaint and that if the crew came back, she would have their vehicles cited or towed. I asked to see the section of the rules she was citing. She held up the laminated sheet and jabbed her finger at a paragraph about setbacks. I leaned in to read it, and she yanked it away. She said I should have read the rules before I moved in, sweetheart. She said the contractor was not licensed, which was a lie, and that I was in violation of county code, which was also a lie. She said the hearing was scheduled for Thursday and that I needed to show up with proof or accept the fines. I nodded like I accepted it, because I wanted her comfortable and careless. The contractor, a guy named Mike who had been doing fences in Pittsburgh for 20 years, pulled me aside and said Ruth had called him 3 times that morning. She told him the permit was fake. She told him the HOA would sue him personally. She told him she had friends at the city who would pull his license. Mike said he had heard stories about her, but he did not believe them until now. He said he would come back on Wednesday to finish the posts, but if she called a tow truck, he was gone. I went inside and pulled every document I had. The approval letter from the HOA, the survey from a licensed surveyor, the contractor license, the county permit, the receipt for the expedited review fee. I also had something else. 2 weeks ago, I had called the city code enforcement office and asked if the HOA had any authority over fence placement on my property. The guy I spoke to, a supervisor named Ed, laughed and said no. He said HOAs in Pittsburgh could regulate appearance and materials, but they could not override city setback rules or property surveys. He sent me a written confirmation on city letterhead. I had been holding it in reserve because I wanted Ruth to commit fully to her story before I pulled the rug out. That night, Ruth posted a notice on my front door. It was printed on Parkside HOA board letterhead, and it said I was in violation of Article 7, Section 4, Subsection C, which governed fencing and boundary structures. It said the fence was unapproved, that the contractor was unlicensed, and that I had 48 hours to remove the posts or face daily fines starting at $200. It said a hearing was scheduled for Thursday at 7 in the evening at the community center, and that failure to attend would result in automatic penalties. I checked the handbook. Article 7, Section 4, Subsection C, was about garden sheds. Wednesday morning, Mike showed up with his crew at 7. Ruth was already there. She had parked her car across my driveway and was standing next to it with her handheld radio and a roll of blue painter tape. She had used the tape to mark alleged boundary zones all along the fence line, sticking strips of it to the grass, the dirt, and even the string line we had set up. She said the tape represented the true property line and that any work beyond it was trespassing. Mike looked at me and shook his head. He said he had seen some wild HOA stunts, but this was a new one. He pulled out his own survey printout and showed Ruth that the posts were exactly where the surveyor had marked them. Ruth said the survey was fake. She said the surveyor was not licensed, which was insane because his name and license number were printed on every page. She said she had her own surveyor coming and that we needed to stop work immediately. I asked when her surveyor was arriving. She said soon. I asked for a name. She said it was none of my business. I asked if she had filed a formal complaint with the city. She said she did not need to because the HOA had jurisdiction. I asked her to show me the rule again. She pulled out the laminated sheet and started reading out loud. She read Section 4, Subsection C, which was about sheds. She did not notice. Mike started laughing. I did not stop him. Ruth kept reading, her voice getting louder, jabbing her finger at the paper. She said the rule was clear and that I was in violation, and that the fines would start immediately if I did not comply. She said she was the reason this neighborhood stayed civilized, and that people like me were ruining it for everyone. I let her finish. Then I said, Ruth, that is the shed rule. She stopped. Her face went red. She looked down at the sheet and flipped it over. She said it did not matter because the fence was still illegal and the hearing would settle it. She said I was playing games and that she had the entire board on her side. She turned and walked back to her car, but she left the blue painter tape all over my yard. The crew finished the posts by noon. Ruth did not come back, but she called Mike 4 more times. He stopped answering. By Wednesday night, I had the framing done and the panels were scheduled for Thursday morning. I also got a text from a neighbor I had never met. He lived 3 doors down and he said Ruth had done the same thing to him 2 years ago when he tried to replace his deck. He said she had called the fire marshal, the zoning board, and even the health department trying to find a violation. He said she eventually gave up after he hired a lawyer, but it cost him $3,000. He said if I needed a witness at the hearing, he would show up. His name was Paul, and he became my first ally. Thursday morning, the panels went up. Ruth showed up at 8 with 2 other board members I had never seen before. She called them her backup. They stood at the edge of my property and took photos. Ruth had a clipboard now, and she was writing notes like she was conducting an official inspection. One of the board members, a guy in his 60s wearing a polo shirt with the HOA logo on it, walked up to the fence and ran his hand along the top rail. He said it looked fine to him. Ruth snapped at him and said he was not a licensed contractor, and that his opinion did not matter. She said the height was wrong, the style was wrong, and the setback was wrong. She said the hearing would prove it. I asked her if she had measurements. She said she did not need measurements because she could see it with her eyes. I held up my tape measure and offered to check it with her. She said I was being condescending and that she was not going to engage with my games. She turned to the other board members and said they needed to file a formal trespass complaint because the contractor was on HOA common property. The guy in the polo shirt said this was not common property. Ruth told him to be quiet. That afternoon, Ruth escalated. She called a tow truck company and told them there were unlicensed contractor vehicles blocking HOA access roads. Mike got a call from the tow dispatcher asking if he had authorization to park on the street. Mike said yes and hung up. 10 minutes later, a tow truck pulled up. The driver, a guy named Carl, got out and looked at Mike's truck. He asked if Mike was the owner. Mike said yes. Carl said he had a call from the HOA about an unauthorized vehicle. Mike showed him the permit and the work order. Carl sighed and said this was the third time this month Ruth had called him for sketchy jobs. Carl became my second ally. He told me Ruth kept calling different tow drivers like she was speed dialing chaos, hoping one of them would hook a truck without asking questions. He said most of the drivers in Pittsburgh knew her by now, and that she had burned bridges with half the companies in the area. He said if she called again, he would ignore it, but I should watch out because she was getting desperate. I thanked him and asked if he would be willing to write a statement about the calls. He said he would do better. He said he would pull the call logs from his dispatch system and send them to me. He said Ruth had been using the HOA compliance hotline to harass contractors all over the neighborhood, and that the logs would prove it. Thursday evening, I showed up at the community center at 6:45. The hearing was supposed to start at 7. The room was set up like a small courtroom with a table at the front for the board and rows of chairs for residents. Ruth was already there with her clipboard, her laminated policy sheet, and a folded plat map printout. She had the blue painter tape roll on the table in front of her like it was evidence. She was talking to another board member, a woman in her 50s who kept nodding and taking notes. Paul, my neighbor, showed up at 6:50. He sat next to me and said he had brought copies of his own HOA fight from 2 years ago. He said Ruth had used the same tactics then, including fake survey claims and contractor harassment. He said the board eventually overruled her, but only after he threatened to sue. At 7, the board called the meeting to order. There were 5 members. Ruth sat in the middle. She started by reading the complaint. She said I had installed a fence without proper approval, that the contractor was unlicensed, that the setback was incorrect, and that the corner post had been moved to encroach on a neighbor's property. She said the violations were clear, and that the board needed to impose immediate fines and order removal of the structure. I raised my hand. The board president, an older guy named Tom, asked me to wait until Ruth finished. Ruth kept going. She said I had been uncooperative, that I had refused to provide documentation, and that I had been hostile toward board members during inspections. She said the contractor had blocked access roads and that the HOA had received multiple complaints from neighbors. I looked around the room. There were maybe 10 people there. None of them looked like they had filed complaints. Ruth finished and sat down. Tom asked if I wanted to respond. I stood up and pulled out my folder. I started with the approval letter. I passed a copy to the board. Ruth said it was outdated. I said it was dated 8 weeks ago and that the rules had not changed. I showed them the survey. Ruth said the surveyor was not licensed. I showed them his license number and the state registry printout. Ruth said the survey was incorrect. I asked if she had her own survey. She said her surveyor was still working on it. Tom asked Ruth if she had filed a formal complaint with the city. Ruth said she had not because the HOA had jurisdiction. Tom looked confused. He said the HOA could regulate appearance and materials, but not setbacks or property lines. Ruth said that was not true and that the handbook gave the board full authority. Tom asked her to show him the rule. Ruth held up the laminated sheet. I interrupted. I said, Ruth, that is the shed rule. You read it out loud yesterday. The room went silent. Ruth looked down at the sheet. Her face went red again. She flipped it over and said it did not matter because the fence was still in violation. Tom asked her which rule applied. Ruth said Article 7, Section 4, Subsection C. Tom pulled out his own copy of the handbook and read it. He looked up and said, Ruth, this is about sheds. One of the other board members started laughing. Ruth snapped at him and said he was not taking this seriously. Tom said he was taking it very seriously and that Ruth needed to cite the correct rule or drop the complaint. Ruth said the rule did not matter because the fence was clearly illegal and everyone could see it. I pulled out the city code enforcement confirmation. I passed it to Tom. He read it out loud. It said the HOA had no authority over fence placement as long as the fence complied with city setback rules and the property survey. It said any attempt to fine or penalize a homeowner for a city-approved fence would be considered harassment and could result in penalties against the HOA. Tom looked at Ruth. He asked if she had seen this before. Ruth said it was fake. Tom said it was on city letterhead with a supervisor's signature and a case number. Ruth said the supervisor was lying. Tom asked me if I had anything else. I said I did. I pulled out Carl's call logs. I explained that Ruth had been calling tow truck companies trying to get my contractor vehicles towed without authorization. I said Carl had pulled the dispatch records and that they showed Ruth had made 11 calls in 3 days. I said half of those calls were for other contractors in the neighborhood, and that Ruth had been using the compliance hotline to harass anyone who did work she did not approve. Tom asked Ruth if this was true. Ruth said she was doing her job. Tom said her job was not to call tow trucks on licensed contractors with valid permits. Ruth said the contractors were a nuisance and that residents had complained. Tom asked which residents. Ruth said she could not share that information because it was confidential. Paul stood up. He said Ruth had done the same thing to him 2 years ago and that she had cost him $3,000 in legal fees. He said Ruth had called the fire marshal, the zoning board, and the health department trying to find a violation on his deck, and that every agency had told her to stop wasting their time. He said this happened to him too, and that Ruth had been running the compliance hotline like a personal vendetta machine for years. Another resident in the back raised her hand. She said Ruth had threatened to fine her for planting flowers in her front yard without approval. She said Ruth had told her the flowers were invasive, which was not true, and that she needed to remove them or face daily penalties. She said she had removed the flowers because she could not afford a fight. Tom looked at Ruth. He said this was a serious problem. Ruth said everyone was lying and that she was being attacked because she was the only one willing to enforce the rules. She said the board was supposed to support her and that she was not going to sit there and be insulted. Tom said the hearing was over and that the board would vote on the complaint. He called for a motion to dismiss. 3 board members raised their hands immediately. Ruth did not. The last board member, the woman who had been taking notes, hesitated and then raised her hand. The complaint was dismissed. Tom said the board would review the compliance hotline procedures and that Ruth would not be allowed to make unilateral decisions about fines or penalties going forward. Ruth stood up and said she was not going to be part of a board that did not respect her authority. She said she was the reason this neighborhood stayed civilized, and that without her, the whole place would fall apart. She grabbed her clipboard and walked out. I thought that was the end of it. It was not. If you are enjoying this chaos, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA nightmare stories. Friday morning, I got a call from Tom. He said the board had called an emergency meeting for Sunday afternoon, and that I should attend. He said Ruth had sent an email to the entire neighborhood claiming the board had ignored safety violations, and that she was being silenced for doing her job. He said the email included photos of my fence and a list of alleged code violations. He said half of it was made up, and the other half was plagiarized from a forum post about a different state. I asked what the meeting was about. Tom said the board was going to address Ruth's conduct and that they needed witnesses. He said Paul had already agreed to come, and that Carl, the tow truck driver, had offered to testify about the call logs. He said if I was willing to share the city code enforcement confirmation and the call logs, the board could take formal action. I said yes. Sunday afternoon, I showed up at the community center at 2. The room was packed. Ruth had rallied a group of residents who believed her story, and they were sitting in the front rows with printed copies of her email. Ruth was at the front table again, but this time, she was sitting in the audience section with her supporters. She had the blue painter tape roll on her lap and a stack of papers that looked like property records. Tom called the meeting to order and explained that the board was reviewing complaints about compliance enforcement procedures. He said the board had received multiple reports of harassment, false claims, and unauthorized penalties. He said the board took these reports seriously and that they were conducting a formal review. Ruth stood up and said this was a witch hunt. She said she had been enforcing the rules fairly and that the board was retaliating because she had exposed violations. She said I had bribed the board with fake documents and that the whole hearing on Thursday was rigged. She said the fence was still illegal and that she had proof. Tom asked her to present the proof. Ruth held up the folded plat map printout. She said it showed the true property line and that my fence was 6 inches over. She said the surveyor I had hired was incompetent and that her surveyor had confirmed the encroachment. I asked if her surveyor was here. Ruth said he was not because he was busy. I asked if she had a written report. Ruth said it was being finalized. I asked if she had paid for the survey. Ruth hesitated. She said the HOA had paid for it. Tom asked when. Ruth said 2 weeks ago. Tom pulled out the HOA budget ledger. He said there was no record of a survey payment in the last 6 months. Ruth said it was paid from the discretionary fund. Tom said the discretionary fund required board approval for any expense over $500 and that no survey had been approved. Ruth said she had used her own money and that the HOA would reimburse her. Tom asked how much the survey cost. Ruth said $1,500. Tom asked to see the receipt. Ruth said she did not have it with her. Paul stood up. He said he had pulled the public records for HOA expenses and that there were 3 discretionary fund payments in the last year that did not match any approved projects. He said the payments totaled $4,000 and that Ruth had signed off on all of them. He said one of the payments was dated the same week she had started the fence complaints. Tom looked at Ruth. He asked if she had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. Ruth said the payments were legitimate and that Paul was twisting the facts. Tom said the board would audit the discretionary fund and that Ruth needed to provide documentation for every payment. Ruth said this was harassment and that she was not going to participate in a corrupt process. She said she was resigning from the board effective immediately. She stood up and walked toward the door. Tom said the board accepted her resignation. But Ruth was not done. Monday night, I got a motion alert from my doorbell camera. It was 11:30. I opened the app and saw Ruth standing on my front porch. She was holding a clipboard and a flashlight. She was wearing the same black windbreaker and gray baseball cap. She was taking photos of my fence from the porch angle. She walked down the steps and moved along the fence line, running her hand along the panels and checking the posts. She pulled out the blue painter tape and started marking spots on the fence. I saved the video. Tuesday morning, I got a certified letter from Ruth. It was not on HOA letterhead. It was on her personal stationery. It said I was in violation of county noise ordinances, property maintenance codes, and public nuisance statutes. It said she had filed complaints with the county and that I needed to remove the fence or face legal action. It said she was representing a group of concerned neighbors and that they were prepared to sue. I called the county. They said Ruth had not filed any complaints. I called the city code enforcement office and spoke to Ed, the supervisor who had sent me the confirmation letter. I explained what had happened and sent him the doorbell video. He said Ruth's letter was threatening legal action based on false claims and that it could be considered harassment. He said if I wanted to file a complaint, the city would investigate. I said yes. Ed said he would send an inspector to verify the fence and document Ruth's claims. He said if the fence was in compliance, which he was confident it was, the city would send Ruth a cease and desist letter. He said if she continued, the city could impose penalties. Wednesday afternoon, a city inspector showed up. His name was Marcus, and he had a clipboard, a tape measure, and a laser level. He checked every post, every panel, and every measurement. He compared the fence to the survey and the city setback rules. He took photos. He asked about Ruth's complaints. I showed him the doorbell video, the certified letter, and the call logs from Carl. Marcus said the fence was in perfect compliance. He said Ruth's claims were completely false. He said he had seen cases like this before where HOA board members used code enforcement as a weapon and that the city took it seriously. He said he would file a report and recommend a cease and desist letter. He also said the city was opening an investigation into Ruth's use of false complaints, and that if she had filed similar reports about other properties, she could face penalties. Thursday, I got a call from Tom. He said the board had completed the audit of the discretionary fund. He said Ruth had made 5 unauthorized payments, totaling $6,000 over the past year. He said 3 of the payments were to vendors who did not exist, and 2 were to her personal checking account. He said the board was filing a formal complaint with the police and that Ruth could face embezzlement charges. I asked if the fence fines would be refunded. Tom said the board had reviewed every compliance case Ruth had handled in the past 2 years and that they had found a pattern of false violations and excessive penalties. He said the board was automatically refunding every fine Ruth had imposed without proper documentation. He said the refunds would go out within 30 days. Friday afternoon, I got a call from Ed at the city. He said the inspector had finished his report and that the city had sent Ruth a cease and desist letter. He said the letter warned her that filing false code complaints was a misdemeanor and that continued harassment could result in prosecution. He said the city had also forwarded the doorbell video to the police because Ruth's late-night inspection could be considered trespassing. I asked what happened next. Ed said it was up to me. He said if I wanted to press charges, the police would investigate. He said if I just wanted Ruth to leave me alone, the cease and desist letter would probably be enough. I said I wanted to press charges. Ed said he would forward my request to the detective handling HOA fraud cases. He said the detective would contact me within a week. The following Tuesday, I got a call from Detective Linda Hayes. She said she was investigating Ruth's conduct and that the city had flagged her for multiple code enforcement complaints that turned out to be false. She said the doorbell video was strong evidence of trespassing and harassment. She asked if I would be willing to testify if the case went to court. I said yes. Detective Hayes said Ruth had been using the compliance hotline to target residents she did not like, and that the call logs showed a clear pattern. She said Ruth had also been embezzling HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including the fake survey and legal fees for unrelated disputes. She said the district attorney was reviewing the case and that charges were likely. 2 weeks later, Ruth was arrested. The charges included embezzlement, filing false reports, and harassment. The local news picked up the story because it was the first HOA fraud case in Pittsburgh in 5 years. The headline said, HOA board member arrested for fake fence violations and embezzlement. The Parkside HOA board held another emergency meeting. Tom announced that Ruth had been removed from the board and that the board was implementing new compliance procedures. He said all future violations would require documentation, board approval, and an appeals process. He said the board was also hiring an independent management company to oversee enforcement and prevent future abuse. Paul stood up and said the board should apologize to every resident Ruth had targeted. Tom agreed. He said the board would send personal letters to everyone who had been fined or harassed and that the refunds would include interest. A month later, I got a check for $800. It was the refund for the bogus fence fines Ruth had threatened, plus interest. The board also sent a letter apologizing for Ruth's conduct and thanking me for bringing the issue to their attention. Carl, the tow truck driver, called me and said Ruth had been banned from calling his company. He said the other tow companies in Pittsburgh had done the same, and that Ruth was now on a regional blacklist. Paul invited me over for a barbecue. He said the neighborhood felt different now that Ruth was gone. He said people were actually talking to each other instead of hiding from the compliance hotline. The case went to trial 6 months later. Ruth pleaded guilty to embezzlement and filing false reports. She was sentenced to probation, community service, and ordered to repay the $6,000 she had stolen from the HOA. The judge also banned her from serving on any HOA board for 10 years. At the sentencing hearing, the judge read a statement from the Parkside HOA board. It said Ruth had abused her position, harassed residents, and damaged the community. It said the board had implemented new safeguards to prevent future abuse and that the neighborhood was healing. The judge looked at Ruth and said, "You used your authority to intimidate and harm the people you were supposed to serve. You lied, you stole, and you made life miserable for anyone who challenged you. This court will not tolerate that conduct." Ruth sat in silence. The last time I saw her, she was leaving the courthouse with her lawyer. She did not look at me. My fence is still standing. It has been 3 years, and I have not had a single complaint. The new board is reasonable, professional, and actually follows the rules. The compliance hotline is gone. If you want to build something, you file an application online and get a response in 2 weeks. Paul and I are still neighbors. Carl still drives a tow truck. Ed retired from the city last year. Detective Hayes moved to a different unit. And Ruth? I heard she moved to another state. I hope the HOA there is ready. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next HOA story.